And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. It is time to talk U.S. men's national team as we set the stage for these final two games before the World Cup. Three specific, sort of big picture things I am looking at in these two games that I think we can actually get a pretty good idea about. Because it is always fair to wonder how much can you really learn from friendlies, even ones this close to the World Cup, with teams, bringing in something that is going to look very close to their World Cup rosters. But there are some things I do think we can learn. My first big question, talking point, curiosity, whatever you want to frame it as, and it's something I've talked about before, but we're going to get two more examples of it, and that is simply, what does this team look like against World Cup opponents? Playing in CONCACAF, you get, I mean, I would argue, well, it's between 4 and 6 usually, right? World Cup qualifiers against something resembling a squad you would see in the World Cup. Mexico, certainly. Canada, certainly. And in the past, it's been a Costa Rica. This Costa Rica team did squeak in, but it's a different Costa Rica. So I would argue it's the U.S. got more like 4. And then, of course, you've got a Nations League final against Mexico and those kind of things. But you compare that to what you see in CONMEBOL or especially in UEFA, where you're playing Nations League games and you're playing, Belgium, Poland, Czech Republic, Ireland, and Iceland or something in your Nations League group, or Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, England, and France, something like that. You just get so much more exposure to other teams on your level, and that's not the case in CONCACAF, which makes these opportunities, and I talked about this the last window as well, to play other teams going to the World Cup really, really important. And the other thing that you are going to get a better idea of that is crucial heading into Qatar, can you play out of the back / win games multiple ways? Are you able to control tempo against teams like Japan and Saudi Arabia? These are perfect tests for this concept. Perfect ways to test this hypothesis. And it's especially important in this group the U.S. was drawn into, because you are not playing the same game against Iran and Wales that you are against England. I'm confident in this team's ability to play sort of the counter-attacking transition game they're going to have to against England. That part I feel really good about. Doesn't mean I'm going to pick them to win the game, but that's what the U.S. has always done at World Cups, right? They've always found a way to kind of rise to the occasion and play up to their opponents. This is the first team where you look at it on paper and go, they should be able to dictate the terms of, I would argue, both the Iran game and the Wales game, in part because of the way Wales play. Wales aren't interested in dictating the terms of games. They're interested in getting Gareth Bale 1v1, getting into set pieces, and limiting your chances and just kind of absorbing a bunch of pressure and making the game rather boring. It's incredibly effective, and as I've talked about before, it's incredibly effective at tournaments. So in games like that, can the U.S. play out of the back, maintain possession, build, and actually look comfortable with the ball? That's always been the big question about this team when they face better opponents, right? Can they do things with the ball? And this is the most technically gifted team they've ever had. So we're going to get to see what this looks like against two teams that are somewhere on the US's level. You can maybe, I mean, Saudi Arabia a little bit lower, but neither of these teams are going to sit back and just absorb a bunch of pressure. The US is going to have to make things happen in these games. So that's my first question is I just want to see against as many different World Cup opponents as possible, how effective is the US in being able to implement a plan A and being able to do something other than play in transition and on the counter? Because you know that's going to be there. What happens in the two games where you're probably not going to be able to do that? And when teams are trying to do that against you? That's the question that is going to be vital to their World Cup success that we don't really know the answer to. And all we're doing is gathering more data to make a better, more informed hypothesis because that answer is only going to be revealed at the World Cup. But the more data points you have, the better of an idea you have going in. Number two, what does this look like without Yunus Musa? Who plays in that role? Johnny Cardoso is the guy who got brought in to replace him. I would have gone in a different direction probably, but we are where we are. I'm not here to talk about the squad at this point. I am much more interested in, okay, so how does that hole in the lineup get filled? Now that you have Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams there, along with Christian Pulisic and Gio Reyna and Brendan Aronson, what does Greg Berhalter decide to do? Is that Brendan Aronson? Is that Luca de la Torre? Is that Kellen Acosta? There are so many different ways Berhalter could go with that spot. And then the second part of this question for me is, can this team actually move the ball from back to front and build out of the back and actually connect from one line to the next? Because that is something Yunus Musa is spectacular at. He is such a good ball carrier. He does so much of that work for you. And the U.S. don't have a long list of players capable of doing that the way Musa can. However, Luca de la Torre is one of them. That is also his great strength, right? Just his ability to take players on and to just bring the ball forward. A lot of the other players I mentioned, not exactly what they do. So that's where I am curious. Is it de la Torre? Because then you're doing the closest thing you can to a like-for-like swap. But if it's Brendan Aronson there, you're playing a whole different game. If it's Kellen Acosta there, you're playing a whole different game. And so the final question with that is, this is all preparation for a world in which Yunus Musa, for one reason or another, is unavailable at a World Cup game. You've got to have a plan B. I don't know what that plan B is. There are other, it's not that there isn't one. There are so many options and different ways Berhalter could go. Now you have 180 minutes to test these things and see which ones work and which ones don't. And then, third, of course, is the final roster spots. So I got some subcategories here. First, very simply, can Sam Vines lock down the second left back spot on this roster? I talked about this when the roster came out. Greg Berhalter, without really trying to sort of spin it or cushion it at all, said, we have two left-footed left backs we feel good about. We're going to bring a bunch of right-footers who can play on the left side if those guys aren't available. One of them isn't available in this window in Jedi Robinson. So Sam Vines is going to get at least one start, I have to believe. And just from a logical standpoint, if he is in this camp and Berhalter doesn't trust any other left-sided, left-footed left back, you have to believe it's his spot to lose. Which then makes it another conversation of how does the right back spot end up playing, because Serginho Dest and Joe Scally can both play on the left, and you have Jack Moore and Reggie Cannon and DeAndre Yedlin. I've talked about that a little bit before. I'm not going to get into it here. But there is sort of a knock-on effect from this Sam Vines situation. He's playing the best soccer of his life. If you want players in form going to the World Cup, Sam Vines is on your squad. And also, the Joe Scally experiment didn't go so well. It's one game. I'm not going to put a huge amount of stock into it long term. But we're talking about the World Cup was 5-6 months or whatever away when that happened. And now we're talking 2. You don't have time for a guy to learn on the fly. Ideally, this player is not on the field very much at all because Jedi Robinson is playing every single game. But again, in that situation, you have to be prepared. And I will be concerned if Sam Vines is not on this team because every indication from his performance to what Greg Berhalter has been saying to the actual roster pool available suggests he is that second left back. I want to see what he looks like with this team, and I want to see if he lives up to those expectations. Then you go to the center backs. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree or disagree, Walker Zimmerman and Aaron Long are going to Qatar. That is essentially a lock in my head at this point, based on what Greg Berhalter is doing. Not my personal opinion, just Greg Berhalter's the one putting this roster together. Those 2 guys are going. Those are his top 2 center backs. After that, it gets a lot more interesting. And so it spoke volumes that Cameron Carter-Vickers and Chris Richards were the guys who got called into this camp. And then both of them had to pull out. And so now Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie are in this camp. I would like to point out here, to take a second to point out, Celtic did lose to St. Mirren without Cameron Carter-Vickers. Do with that as you please. I just did think it was worth pointing out. A team that has been so dominant in the Scottish Premiership does lose to, it wasn't a loss to Rangers. They dominated Rangers and Cameron Carter-Vickers played. I'm not saying they lost because he wasn't there, but it's an interesting little tidbit I wanted to throw in here. And going back to what Berhalter said when he announced this squad, I am of the belief that these 4 guys I mentioned, Palmer-Brown, McKenzie, Carter-Vickers, and Richards, are battling for those final 2 center back spots. Greg Berhalter essentially said, Tim Ream's good at a lot of things. He's not very good at the things we need our center backs to be good at. That does not sound like somebody Greg Berhalter is interested in taking, again, whether you agree or not. We can only have so much conversation about who should go. At some point, you got to start talking about what this is actually going to look like and what Greg Berhalter thinks. So it was not surprising at all to me that these are the 2 guys who got the call. And you look at their club situations, and Chris Richards isn't playing. Cameron Carter-Vickers is. And I think Cameron Carter-Vickers was in a really good position, and still is, to make this team. In terms of getting left out and having to back out of this camp, I am much more concerned if I'm Chris Richards than if I'm Cameron Carter-Vickers. And so you're talking about 2 guys in Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie who are playing regularly in Europe. Now, they're not in the Premier League like Richards. They're not in the Champions League like Carter-Vickers. But if you're Greg Berhalter and you're looking at this in terms of your center backs, and either Palmer-Brown or McKenzie impresses you in this camp and continues to play well for their club in the next month and a half, it is going to be hard for Chris Richards to convince you he deserves a spot. Chris Richards essentially at this point is banking, unless he somehow finds a way to work into the Crystal Palace team, is banking on the resume he already has and the goodwill he's built up to make this roster. It's unfortunate. It's not fair because Greg Berhalter wanted to give him this opportunity and the injury prevented it. But it is the reality of this situation when you only have this one window left. So, I'm still looking at this as Eric Palmer-Brown and Mark McKenzie have work to do to prove to Greg Berhalter they should be 4th or 3rd on the depth chart, not 5th or 6th. But if one of them can make that jump and convince Berhalter in this camp, I I think it's going to be difficult for Chris Richards to retake that spot from them. So that's a really interesting dynamic of this for me as well. Then we get to, of course, the strikers. Ricardo Pepi, scoring goals again, in good form, seems to be in a much better place now he's in the Eredivisie. So he gets this call, and like I said before, Greg Berhalter wanted to give him this opportunity. I am not convinced that means he is determined to have Ricardo Pepi on the World Cup team. I guess I'll put it that way. What I think it means is Greg Berhalter wanted to give Ricardo Pepi a chance to prove he deserves that spot. There was not another player Berhalter said, we already know what he can do and didn't feel like we needed to see anything from him in this camp. That is what he said about Jordan Pifak. So, as somebody who takes people at their word and takes things literally, I see Pifak as the most likely guy to get on the plane that is not in this camp or was not originally called into this camp. For that reason, that I think is very valid. Greg Berhalter knows exactly who he is. He's watching him perform well in the Bundesliga week in and week out. When Greg Berhalter put this roster together, nobody had any idea what Ricardo Pepi was because he's been out of the picture and he hasn't scored a goal in so long. And his club situation was so messy. So this is the one spot where I'm hesitant to put an incredible amount of stock in the fact that Berhalter picked Pepi over Pifak. That being said, if Pepi performs well here and then goes back to the Netherlands and continues to perform well, I think what we learned is that Berhalter's preference is for Pepi to be that guy. I haven't backed away from that. My opinion, the ultimate takeaway I had from that press conference, like I said last week, he knows what he wants and he's going to stick to it, whether you like it or not. But Pepi actually has to prove he can give Berhalter what Berhalter wants. And that's where I'm kind of, at this point, Berhalter would prefer to have Pepi. I don't think he is determined to take Pepi if Pepi is not in form, if it's not clicking. And then there's Josh Sargent. Josh Sargent scoring boatloads of goals for Norwich City in the championship. Maybe I'm forgetting something, but I can't really point to a single moment in Josh Sargent's national team career where I have been impressed by him and went, wow, he really performed well in this window, in these couple games. I really feel like he is starting to fit in and do the things the striker is asked to in this system. On paper, from a profile standpoint, Josh Sargent is exactly the kind of player Greg Berhalter wants. And this was always supposed to be his position. He was always the future number 9, right? And it just wasn't working at the club level or the international level. And so you had to go look at different places. I am hesitant to go say, because he's scoring and playing well in the championship, that means all of these questions we've had about Josh Sargent when it comes to the national team are just gone. It could very well be he has just found a completely new level of confidence, whatever it might be, and he looks the part in this camp, and that's that he's going on the plane. But think about how many goals Jordan Pifak would score in the championship. He did it in Switzerland, and now he's doing it in Germany. You can compare his numbers to Josh Sargent's, right? They both played in the Bundesliga. Context is a little bit different. I get all that. I'm not necessarily saying it's apples to apples. You get my point, though. Me personally, I need to see something from Josh Sargent to justify taking him over Jordan Pifak. And I think that's how most of the people who follow this U.S. men's national team feel, is frustration that PFOC wasn't on this team. I will go back to what I said before, though. I don't think this is done and dusted. If I have to pick one guy who works his way onto the plane, it's going to be Jordan PFOC. But this camp is about Berhalter getting a look at the strikers. I mean, Jesus Ferreira is probably going to be the starter. I think you can at least write that in pencil, if not pen. So you're bringing him because you want him in these final tune-up games. And you weren't bringing 4 strikers, so all of a sudden you had to choose 2. And Berhalter picked the guys who have sort of this opportunity to reprove themselves and who weren't doing things at the club level to get themselves in a position to be part of this team for the past year or so. I have no issue with that whatsoever. But it leads to a very interesting conversation based on how these two guys play and how many minutes they get. Because if Ferreira starts one game and let's say Pepe gets 45 minutes in the other one and Sargent takes the second half, so they play somewhere between 45 and 60 minutes apiece, how much did you really learn about them? So I'm also curious what Berhalter does with his strikers. Because there's a real argument. Pepe should be starting one game, Sargent should be starting the other. Jesus Ferreira has nothing to prove here. He needs to be there to continue to build camaraderie, right? The 20 or so guys you know are going to the World Cup should be in this camp, and that's exactly what Berhalter did. Doesn't mean you need to play something close to starting lineup both games when you have so many different decisions to make at the striker position involving guys both in and out of this camp. So that is also part of this. It's going to be a conversation until somebody just cements themselves as the guy moving forward and everybody is in agreement with that. Because I would argue Jesus Ferreira has. Nobody seems to be really sold on it, though. So we will see how these strikers do, how they're used, and what the conversation is. Because it's going to be another point of contention when the final roster comes out. Who of the strikers made it? Who didn't? Did Jordan PFOC find a way to work himself back in? Should Jordan PFOC be on the team? All that's going to come back up. But again, all this is more data points to be able to have a better idea of what this is going to look like and to better analyze the final decisions Greg Berhalter makes. That's what this is about. From a team perspective, again, you got 2 World Cup opponents here. Terrific place to experiment and to try and test some hypotheses. You're missing a couple starters in Anthony Robinson, Jedi Robinson, Yunus Musa. How do those guys do? Who steps up and takes those spots? What does it look like in a world where those guys aren't available? And then the 2 big, the goalkeepers you can also throw in here. The injuries, and it's just kind of strange because they weren't all available for this, right? I think Zach Steffen's in this camp if Zach Steffen is healthy. Whether he should be or not, different conversation. But to me, this is really about the center backs because of the way that all played out with the unfortunate injuries, and the strikers because of the PFOC conversation. That is all I've got on the U.S. men's national team. Plenty of content will be coming after these games. Don't you worry about that.